I was in 1969, the Knesset, our parliament, elected me Prime Minister of Israel. You know, and it's interesting, you know, people have always asked me, what is it like being a woman Prime Minister? I don't know. I was never a man Prime Minister before. I mean, I don't really understand all this talk about women's liberation. I never thought it anything special about being a woman. I remember on one trip here to the United States, I saw a poster with my face on it, and it said, "But can she type?" I don't know, I never learned how to type. I mean, the reason the President of Israel asked me to become Prime Minister wasn't because he thought, because I was a woman, but because he believed that I had a majority in our Knesset. Well, this was the situation when I became Prime Minister in March 1969. Yes, we had decisively defeated the Arabs in the Six-Day War. But unfortunately, we were met by the three no's of the Arab world. No peace, no negotiations, no recognition. The Soviet Union had quickly resupplied and rebuilt the armies of Egypt and Syria. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, began its war of terrorism against our civilians, first from their bases in Jordan and later in Lebanon, planting bombs in markets and theaters, attacking school buses, hijacking airplanes. And when they hit us, we hit them back strongly. Yes, we got used to the usual chorus of international condemnation when that happened, but I'd rather listen to that than suffer through another Holocaust. But another problem we had was our main supplier of weapons before the Six-Day War had been France. But because we did not listen to the advice of President de Gaulle and restrain ourselves before the war, he cut off all military aid to us. The only place we could get that military aid would be from the United States. And it meant building up an important relationship with the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. In a way, both our careers are parallel. We both became leaders of our nation in 1969, and we were both forced to resign because of existing political conditions in 1974. He was as much my American president as I was his Israeli prime minister. And we had many fruitful meetings over the years. I remember once, Foreign Minister Abba Eban and I flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who had now become Secretary of State at the White House. Now, remember the President said to me, "You know, Mrs. Mier, we both have something in common. We both have Jewish foreign secretaries." And I said, "Well, that's true, Mr. President, but mine speaks English." But in our discussions, he assured us that there would be a balance of power in the Middle East. And I knew that meant whatever the Arabs received from the Soviet Union, we could expect something from the United States. And eventually it came in the way of F-16 Phantoms and F-4 Skyhawk jets, which would be the mainstay of our defense. He also supported our hard line against terrorism. I remember after the American ambassador Khartoum in the Sudan had been murdered by Palestinian terrorists in March of 1973, he said to me, "You know, Mrs. Mier, you have to understand something. I come from a Quaker background. I was told to abhor capital punishment, but we can never negotiate with these terrorists, never, because if we start now, we will be threatening the lives of many innocent people in the future." And so I knew we had a good, strong friend in the White House. And he was to prove that in October of 1973. Yes, we had received intelligence reports of a buildup of Egyptian forces along the Suez Canal and Syrian forces along the Golan Heights. Why, we had even mobilized our reserves in response to that in the spring of 1973. But it turned out to be a false alarm. But in late September and early October of 1973, we were again receiving similar reports of the same buildup. And then I received a report that the Syrian advisors had, that the Soviet advisors had suddenly left Syria. The same thing happened in 1967, and I knew it meant one thing and one thing only: war. I met with the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Dado Elazar, and our Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, on how we should face this crisis. Dayan said we should immediately reinforce the Golan Heights, and we sent an extra brigade there. Elazar said we should immediately attack the Egyptian and Syrian airfields, have a preemptive strike, just like we did in 1967. Hit them first before they hit us. But we had already been warned by Secretary of State Kissinger, if we were to fire the first shot in a new Middle East war, we could not expect American aid. And we knew that in any new Middle Eastern war, the Egyptians and the Syrians would immediately be resupplied by the Soviet Union. Well, we had received word that an attack was going to come at 6 p.m. on the afternoon, late afternoon of October 6, 1973, at the end of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On that day, even in Israel, where a majority of Jews are not religious, the synagogues are packed, people are fasting. I was meeting in an emergency session with my cabinet, deciding what we should do. But before we could even make a decision, sirens sounded all over Israel at 2 p.m. War had come. The Syrian army opened up with a massive offense against our forces in the Golan Heights, pushing us back towards the Galilee. The Egyptian army had crossed the Suez Canal and established a bridgehead on the east bank of the canal. We mobilized our reserves, and I spoke to the Israeli people that night saying that we would stop this act of madness and have victory. But for those first few days, we were holding on for our very lives, barely containing the attacks. And I was wondering, where is the American aid that President Nixon had promised us? Because the Soviet Union was already resupplying Egypt and Syria. I was personally ready to get on the first plane to Washington and beg for those supplies. I remember during that first week, I was on the phone to our ambassador to Washington, Simcha Dinitz, and he said to me, but Golda, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, I can't call Kissinger now. I said, call him now because tomorrow may be too late. Well, later that week, was the beginning of a massive American arms lift to Israel. And when those first planes arrived, it was the first time that I was to cry during that war. And it would not be the last. We had already issued our first casualty lists, and we had already lost more men than we did in 1967. And we would lose many, many more. But now with this massive American arms lift, we would turn the tide of the war and save many more lives. Oh, and I'd like to set the record straight about Richard Nixon. I know history will judge him very harshly, but he kept every single promise he ever made to us. Within the first week, we stopped the Syrian attacks, pushed them out of the Golan Heights and back towards Damascus. By the end of the second week, we had broken through the Egyptian lines and crossed the Suez Canal, and by the beginning of the third week of the war, we had already surrounded the Egyptian Third Army and entered Suez City. But superpower politics came into play. Under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, a ceasefire was declared, and at kilometer 101, the furthest point of our advance into Egypt, our officers met directly with Egyptian officers to negotiate a disengagement agreement, which was later signed in January of 1974. There was an exchange of prisoners, and we withdrew behind the east bank of the Suez Canal. We later signed a similar agreement with Syria in the spring of 1974. But by the spring of 1974, I felt it was time for this old lady to retire. And so in April of 1974, I submitted my resignation to the President of Israel. And now I'm spending my time in retirement, writing my memoirs and watching my 5 grandchildren grow. And people have asked me about the future. It says, what about the future? Well, ever since I came to Israel more than 50 years ago, the real question has been not what about the future, which is the greatest danger? Will we ever have peace with the Arabs? Yes, I believe we will, but peace will come only when there is a strong Israel. If there is not a strong Israel, there will never be any peace in the Middle East. I can forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but it will be more difficult for me to forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. But as I look back on my life, and I think back to the lessons I received in Zionism as a young girl in Russia, to seeing my children and now my 5 grandchildren growing up in their own state of Israel, free and strong in their own state of